Welcome this evening. My name is Susan Leith. I'm the president of the Bethlehem Historical Association, and it's wonderful to see all of you here for our talk this evening. Before we get to that, I want to make sure I give a warm thank you to the Bethlehem Public Library for partnering with us on presenting this series. We're very appreciative of that. It is a series. We have another talk coming up in November to give you the little teaser. Registration's open for that right now. It's Land Between the Waterfalls, documenting 5 centuries of indigenous land use. It's presented by Justin Wexler of Wild Hudson Valley. Should be a very interesting talk. So that's our November talk coming up. I hope all of you perhaps have been to our Cedar Hill Schoolhouse Museum, where we have local history at its finest. We are open Sunday afternoons. There's only 2 more in October before we close for the season. So please hop down to the museum and check out some great local history. We're open 2 to 4 Sunday afternoons. We have an Election Day bake sale coming up. You probably didn't know that the schoolhouse is a voting spot. You don't have to be voting. You can just come in and buy some baked goods and help support our organization. We'd love to see you there for that. And that is it for my announcements this evening. We will get right to our speaker. I would like to introduce Jill Wetback Knapp. Jill grew up in Latham, New York, graduated from Shaker High School. Jill received her BS in General Agriculture from Cornell and her MS in Agronomy. Agronomy. So she just told me how to pronounce it. I forgot it already. She received also a PhD in that subject from Purdue, where her research focused on wheat production. She's held several positions as executive director of several small not-for-profits from Iowa to New York, and was an adjunct faculty at Berkshire Community College and Ramapo College in New Jersey. After returning to Albany in 2005, Jill became interested in her family history. The result of this interest is her nonfiction book, The Time for Redemption, the story of her great-great-grandfather, William Whitbeck, who was charged with murder of a Rensselaer County Deputy Sheriff Griggs in 1869. I think we're going to hear more about that tonight. Research for that topic exposed her to many other fascinating topics, including the Kittle murder, the Capitol Police District, and her current research interests of the Albany-Susquehanna Railroad, and of course the anti-rent conflict in Rensselaer and Columbia counties. Jill's a member of the Bethlehem Historical Association, on the board of the directors of the Greenbush Historical Society, Dutch Settlers Society of Albany, and the Bethlehem Garden Club. So with great pleasure, I introduce Jill.
Thank you. Well, as the title said, it's Upstate New York Tenant Farmers Rebellion. This is based on my book, The Time for Redemption. Now, I'm hearing feedback. Is it good for you, or are you hearing okay? Okay. Many of you probably are familiar with some issues of the anti-rent wars, which is what the rebellion was. When the Dutch West India Company colonized the land in the early 1600s, wealthy merchants, or patroons as they were called, were allowed to negotiate with the indigenous people to purchase tracts of land. Now, Killian Van Rensselaer, he never came over here, but he claimed a huge area of Albany and Rensselaer counties, practically 752,000 square acres, or over 1.13 square miles. He did this in 1869, but the issue was he had to have that settled with 50 adults in 4 years' time. Now, he was the only person who ever established a patroonship or a manor under the Dutch. But when the English claimed the colony in 1664, they kept up the same policy, except for the patroonships then became manors. And there were numerous manors or land grants set up during this period, the Livingston, the Cortland, a lot of the ones through the Hudson Valley. And the system was very similar to that was set up by the Dutch. Rent was either perpetual or at least for generations. It was not paid in dollars, but it was paid either in bushels of wheat, hens, sometimes even a day's labor with a horse and a wagon. And in some cases, when a person sold the property, he had to pay the landlord 25% of the sale price. Now, this was kind of controversial because they were originally just working on pretty raw land. Now, granted, under the Van Rensselaers, they did have 7 years free pay of rent to get established. But if they'd lived there for 50 or 60 years and had made improvements in a house and then had to pay 25% of all that to the landlord, it was still quite onerous. They also paid the taxes, and they also had restrictions on the water, mineral, and timber rights. There were a lot of questions about legitimacy of these huge tracts. Corruption and bribes were often involved. The descriptions of the boundaries were often vague. It was said more or less, so lots of times it ended up being more. There was one grant that was initially 300 acres, but by the time they wrote up all the claims and everything, it became 60,000 acres. So a lot of people were thinking, was this really legitimate or not? And as early as 1766, there were outbreaks of violence in the Hudson Valley between landlords and tenants. Following the Revolutionary War, the conflicts reignited. Actually, the first person to ever die in a tenant argument was in 1791, and this was a sheriff in Columbia County. By 1795, there were 200 inhabitants of Columbia County that actually petitioned the state legislature to investigate the Livingston family title. And he created a great part of your petitioners are tenants holding under the descendants of Robert Livingston upon terms and conditions oppressive and burdensome to the last degree, unfriendly to all great exertions of industry, and tending to degrade your petitioners from the rank of God of nature destined all mankind to move in to be slaves and vessels. So many of them did consider themselves just what they call vessels, or I don't know if they actually might have considered themselves slaves, but that was a little extreme. But they did consider themselves working under a feudal system. Now, in 1811, there was a legislative committee that was appointed to investigate some of these. And you notice, I think a lot of time when we talk about the anti-rent war, we assume it's pretty much Albany County, and for a while it actually was referred to as the Helderberg War, but it actually was a much broader territory than this. And in this 1811 committee, there were petitioners from Montgomery, Delaware, Dutchess, Otsego, Saratoga, and they all claimed that they were tenants under this George Clark and believed that the property held under him was vested in the people of New York State and not him personally. The legislature really did nothing further with the investigation, but added a resolution requesting a commission be appointed to examine all existing laws relating to landlords and their tenants and to report any practical alternatives which they may recommend. But nothing came to pass. So anyway, we're back to the Van Rensselaers. Now, Stephen Van Rensselaer III, he actually became the 9th patroon, or under the English system, the 6th lord of the manor when he turned 5. Obviously, he was a little too young to manage it. So his uncle Tenbrook, who lived down there at Tenbrook Mansion, he took over until Stephen was of age. Now, Revolutionary War actually had interrupted a lot of the settlement of the Hudson Valley, and the early patroons had been more on trade, not on agriculture. I think you're very familiar with it. The beaver furs were a real industry, as was lumber, and as was wheat. So there really was not a great deal of expansion into the farmland in Albany and Rensselaer counties until after the Revolutionary War. And as of 1712, the Van Rensselaers only had 82 tenants. Now, this picture on the top there, that is actually in your collection, the Bethlehem Historical Society collection, and it's the earliest deed I've ever seen, and I think it's from 1765, and it is one, you notice at the bottom, it is signed by Abraham Tenbrook, and this was one of the early deeds that he was managing for young Stephen at that time. Now, he did become a lord of the manor in 1785 when he turned 21. Feudalism had been extinguished in 1787, but that didn't stop him and his brother-in-law, Alexander Hamilton, to develop what they called a durable lease. Calling it a contract with a tenant as an incomplete sale, they were able to sidestep this issue of feudalism, but they still bound the tenants and his heirs and their heirs to the manor in perpetuity. Stephen was considered, yes.
So I don't quite understand what it means by bounded. Were they, who owned the property and how were they?
The Van Rensselaers owned the property and they leased it, and they had their terms of the agreement was they leased it forever. And if they passed it on, they could pass it to their heirs. But if they sold it to anybody, they sold the lease. They didn't sell the property; they sold the lease.
Thank you.
So Stephen was known as a good patroon. He had been pretty lax in collecting rent for a number of years. You look at this. This I know I took this up in the Helderbergs, and I think it was when I was up there. There was one time they had an open house at that place they called the Castle, and I think this was property there. You notice it's not going to be too easy to grow much of anything when you've got soil like that. So growing wheat was impossible on some places, even under best of conditions. And also in the mid-1830s, there was a lot of disease. There was a Hessian fly was a problem that was killing a lot of wheat plants. So wheat production in this part of New York was very difficult. Anyway, he'd been lax. He was letting people get away with not delivering their wheat to him. And he died in 1839, and his estate was heavily in debt. Well, he had two sons, Stephen IV. He inherited all the land in the West Manor, which was Albany County. His son by his second wife, William Patterson, he inherited the East Manor, or Rensselaer County. And by the terms of his will, they had to collect all the back rents amounting to about $400,000 to pay off the estate's debts. And this is when the what we consider the anti-rent wars really took hold. So this was 1839. Now the brothers demanded back rent. They really were not willing to discuss any terms with people to try to negotiate a settlement here. And this soon resulted in open violence. And by the mid-1840s, this had spread to other counties with similar ownership, particularly Columbia and Delaware counties. To try to control this, there were numerous options proposed between 1839 and 1852. First of all, the legitimacy of the original grants were questioned. As we mentioned, that one grant said more or less, and it was 600 acres, or then it became 60,000 acres. So there were definitely a lot of questions about how these really had been developed and were they really legitimate. There were legislative solutions that were proposed, but none of these were adopted. The deeds were considered contracts, and the Constitution forbade legislation impairing any of the obligations of contracts. So when it would go to the legislature, some of the legislators would feel really, really sorry and want to do something, but every time they came up with an idea, it was usually shot down as being unconstitutional. And there was armed resistance from the farmers, who often disguised themselves as Calico Indians, and this resulted in the use of the local militia. To help make progress on this, there were anti-rent organizations that were set up. And the goal of most of them was to elect legislators that were sympathetic to their causes and to raise funds for legal action. Now, many of these people were well-known community leaders. One of them here was John I. Slingerland, who lived just out here in Slingerland. Another one that probably most people associate with the anti-rent issue is Dr. Smith A. Boughton, who was known as Big Thunder. He was from Rensselaer County. And then another one, which is what most of the story is going to be about today, is Willard Griggs, who was also from Rensselaer County. Now, some portion of these anti-renters disguised themselves as Indians, and while disguised, they would violently attack sheriffs, attempting to serve papers on people to either pay the rent or dispossess them from the farm for not paying the rent. And they also would attack landowners who did pay the rent because they felt they were traitors to the cause. Now, the distinction between the Indians in disguise and anti-rent members of the organizations with legal political agendas is really blurry at best. I mean, a lot of the anti-rent organizations disassociated themselves with the Indians, and yet, you know, it was well known that many of those Indians were members of the anti-rent organizations. just a little bit about John Slingerlands. I wanted to make this have some connection to Bethlehem. He was a member of the New York State Assembly, 1843 and 1844. He was elected as a Whig to the 13th Congress from March 1847 to 1849. And he was a member of the New York State Assembly in 1860 and 1861. And he died here in Slingerlands in 1861. Big Thunder, again, he's the one that most people associate with this movement. He was the leader of the anti-renters. And while he was from Rensselaer County, he was arrested in Columbia County in 1844 for robbing a deputy sheriff of his papers when he was trying to evict someone. That trial resulted in a hung jury. The second trial was held in September 1844, and this was shortly after a deputy in in Delaware County had been murdered. So there were a lot of really strong feelings about the anti-rent issues at that point. Smith was found guilty at that time, and he was sentenced to life at Dannemora to set an example. Willard Griggs, he represented the town of Nassau and or the county of Rensselaer in a lot of anti-rent conventions. He actually threw a party for Big Thunder between the time of his first and second trials. And Willard was also appointed to a resolutions committee of the anti-renters, where he said, "We believe if elected will best advance the principles which all anti-renters have heretofore advocated for and for which they still contend." Now, he was also a Rensselaer County deputy sheriff in the 1850s, and what's really ironic, and I never figured out what made him change his position, he later became a deputy on the payroll of Colonel Church, enforcing these leases against the farmers. So it was interesting that he had once been a very strong anti-renter himself, and then he began working for Colonel Church. Anyway, again, on October 15th, 1846, the anti-rent Whig Party met here in Bethlehem, and Slingerlands was nominated. It was said, "This gentleman will secure the anti-rent vote in the district." The goal at that point was to get Bounton out of jail, and also some of the people that had been accused of murdering the deputy in Delaware County were also in jail up in Dannemora, and they wanted to see them set free as well. In 1848, Slingerlands was still active in the anti-rent convention in Albany, and again, that objective of that was supporting candidates that were favorable to their cause. Now, this was from 1851. Not everybody really thought this was such a good idea. There was a lot of opposition to the anti-renters. Anti-rentism. The anti-renters of the state of New York have been holding a convention at Albany. Their movements and policies seem to be based on not only the vote yourself a farm principle, but on that of vote yourself somebody else's farm. This is curious enough, but superadded to the curiosity is that the list of the names of the most prominent who figured in this convention, to wit, Messrs. Singerland, Tarbach, Spawn, Wigsby, Peter Finkel, and he was a really bad dude, Frinky, and Devlis. I never can pronounce those names. These names seem to be appropriate to the object in view, and we have no doubt the convention had a good time of it. Now, the only ones that I'm familiar with are Peter Finkel and Slingerlands, and I will say that Peter Finkel was a pretty extremist, put it mildly. Anyway, in 1852, the Court of Appeals declared that the conveyances were really not leases at all, but they were actually deeds in fee simple, which meant that the farmers actually owned the land and everything with it. Like when you buy a house, you buy a house in fee simple. You get the rights to the property, you get the rights to water, anything that's on it. So this was decided that these farmers really did own the land. And at that point, the Van Rensselaers gave up their claims. The decision, however, was reversed by another court in 1854, and this one favored the landlords. Now, at that point, we have Walter S. Church enter. He simply comes in as a stranger on speculation and buys casual or disputed claims as he would buy lottery tickets or stocks in Wall Street. If successful, his fortune is made. If unsuccessful, he is no worse off than any other speculator. Now, Colonel Church, again, in my opinion, was another one of the bad guys. His father, he was actually the grandson of Angelica Schuyler, so he had impressive family history. His father had a huge estate out in Allegheny County, but when his father died, Walter was kind of the black church of the family, so when the father died, his father only willed Church $50. And I think all his mother gave him was a set of books or something like that. So he really was, not the favored son. His father had written a letter, which at the time was the way it was handled, had written a letter asking for him to be admitted to West Point, and he finally did get in. He lasted one semester at West Point because he flunked out for not being up to par in math. So, he was kind of a wannabe. Anyway. But he took enforcement actions against those farmers that were in arrears, and he evicted numerous farmers. In the case of W.S. Church against William Haydorn and Joseph M. McChesney, executions were placed in the hands of the sheriff yesterday. The amount of the execution against each is about $500, including costs, or more than 8 times the amount of rent claimed to be due. So he obviously was not, making deals with anybody either. Now, interestingly, during the Civil War in 1862, the National Guard was founded, and his old school friend, Governor Horatio Seymour at that point, appointed Church Colonel of the 25th Regiment. Now remember, he flunked out of West Point after one semester, but now he's getting an appointment as a colonel, which his father had duly served in the service, and he had only been a captain, so he actually outranked his father for doing nothing. It was also suspected he was a Southern sympathizer or a Copperhead, as they were called. Well, after the war, he used this regiment of his to enforce these leases. In May 1865, the regiment went to Berne to evict Hiram Secor. They camped at Peter Ball's. They billeted themselves upon the premises of old Peter Ball. They burnt his firewood, and they cooked his vegetables, and they lodged in his barn, and they put an armed guard about the place, and they ate, and they drank, and they sang, and they swore. Now, he actually had the gall to submit a bill to the Albany County Legislature for $115 for his own personal expenses in this little escapade. They said no way. But to think of it, that he was a character. Anyway, generally though, he did not use his regiment. He used local sheriffs. And he had 3 local sheriffs that were on his payroll. William Southard from Rensselaerville, Leonard Whitbeck from Albany, and Willard Griggs from Sand Lake. Now things had been calm for a few years until Tuesday afternoon, July 27th, 1869. And a clap of thunder from a clear sky could not be more startling than this reopening of the old anti-rent struggle. But this murderous affray reopens the agitation, and as there is great excitement in the region where it occurred, it is impossible to predict what will be the result. Well, this happened at William Whitbeck's house. He had 2 farms. He had the beautiful Brick House Farm, which is on Thompson Hill Road. If you're familiar at all with East Greenbush, Thompson Hill Road is a little side street that goes off of Route 4 down where Walmart and all of that is. Right next to it was where they had proposed to build the casino in East Greenbush when they were looking for casino locations. And his Hollow Farm was down at the base of Olcott Hill. This now is sort of right across Red Mill Creek from where they're putting in that huge new Regeneron factory building. So it's getting to be very, very developed. These 2 farms now were less than a mile apart at the time, and at one time back then there was a bridge across the Red Mill Creek, so it was easy to get between the 2. Now, Church had obtained a writ of possession on the Hollow Farm. He got this on July 20th, 1869, and he went out with a couple of his deputies, Griggs and Southard, and they served the writ on Mr. Crean, who was renting the farm from William Whitbeck. Now, Crean, he didn't really care, who owned the farm. He was farming as a renter. He just wanted to farm. But it got back to William by that Church had possession, and so on Saturday, July 24th, he went down and had what he called a haying bee. He invited a lot of friends to come. They expected that Church might come back, and he had told the guy holding the farm to get lost because it was his farm. But people heard him say that he would not give up the place as long as blood ran in his veins. Well, nobody showed up. Church didn't come back on that day. So they all went home, but he knew that Church wasn't going to let this go for long. So again, they gathered there on Monday, June 26th, but again, there was threat of rain, so there really wasn't much for the men to do. So a lot of them were just fooling around. They were wrestling and whittling and things like that. He was there that day with his two older sons, John B. and Benjamin, his elderly father-in-law, Benjamin Dennison, his son-in-law, Zadok Bass, who was married to his daughter, Jenny, and there were a lot of local farm hands that were friends of the family as well. There was also one young guy who was working on a farm that summer who was actually from Illinois, so he had very few attachments to the area, but he was there just as, one of the hands. William's two younger sons, Alberto, who was my great-grandfather, and another son, William Henry, they remained at home. Well, anyway, around 11 o'clock in the morning, Griggs shows up with this deputy, with David McAllister. They just stopped by. They were on their way to Albany to see Colonel Church, and he thought he'd stop by to see how things were going. And McAllister heard Whitbeck say, I heard Whitbeck say he would die before he would leave the farm. So they went on to see Church in Albany, and Church told Griggs to go and execute the writ of ejectment. I mean, he dispossessed him. Whitbeck had taken it back, and he wanted him off. Well, Griggs said that he would execute the writ, but he would need a strong force to do it because he could see that there were a bunch of men on the farm, and Whitbeck was pretty determined that he wasn't just going to roll over and give him the farm. So anyway, they went and they rounded up a posse of roughs from the south end of Albany. Now, most of these men were unemployed or out of work iron workers. And, the thought of a few dollars to go and spend an afternoon on a farm appealed to him. Colonel Church, however, he did not go because he was having dinner with Commodore Vanderbilt of the New York Central Railroad. He was also scheming with other things. Anyway, around 4 p.m., the posse reached the farm and shots were fired. William Whitbeck and Griggs both fell, and Deputy Leonard Whitbeck and others were also shot. Now, there were other weapons that were used as well. A posse member, when asked about the axe, I used it, meant to do all I could to take the farm. I threw the axe, looked out for myself, did not act in self-defense, except for when I hit the man down. I saw him getting the pistol, and I knocked him down with a brick. I was afraid he might get up and hurt me. I went to enforce the law. There were about 15 men who went. Our party picked up sticks. They carried them around and hit anyone they could. I hit any head that came in the way of my club. Well, with this much violence going on and with the deputy Leonard Whitbeck being shot, the posse fled. And people all along the way said it was a regular bull run. That posse came from Greenbush like a flock of frightened sheep. Now, William Whitbeck, who was wounded, he'd been shot in the back of the head. He was taken to his brick house. And Griggs, who was even worse injured, he was taken to Veter's Hotel in Blooming Grove by the Whitbeck faction. He had been left there bleeding badly and badly injured by his own posse. Well, they decided to take Griggs to his home on Sand Lake on Tuesday. Warrants were sworn out for the arrest of the Whitbecks because they were the ones that was accused with starting it all. But the sheriff couldn't be found, and so the warrants were not delivered, which gave time for the young man, Will Wood, who was the young man from Illinois, to get out of there. As he had no connections to the area and he had heard there were warrants, he thought probably better to just flee. So at midnight, Tuesday, he left town. So the rest of them were arraigned in Troy. They were actually posted $6,000 bail to be held over for a hearing on August 3rd. Now, I'm amazed at the amount of bail that these folks had to enter. I mean, even today, $6,000 bail for a lot of people would be considered excessive. But this was back in 1869, and these were bails, and these people were coming up with it. So many of them were fairly well-to-do. Well, Griggs lingered for 6 days. He had not spoken since he was first injured, his tongue and palate torn by a pistol shot, and he lay in that condition. In the language of the law, languishingly did he live. He died at home at 7 a.m. on August 2nd at the age of 58. So a coroner's jury was then impaneled, and this was held at Griggs' home, which was not uncommon. And that's frequently when they did autopsies or postmortems. They were done in the victim's home. There was a whole book, even as late as 1890, that was explained how you would do this. Anyway, John and Benjamin Whitbeck were arrested and jailed. William Whitbeck, due to his injury, remained at home. The autopsy declared that the deceased came to his death from a hemorrhage from the middle meningeal artery on the left side, producing compression on the brain. But he had also been shot 7 times. So, you know, if that hadn't killed him, surely one of the bullets would have. So they started calling witnesses on Tuesday, August 3rd. And the testimony here was pretty conflicting, and many of the people that had been there that day had really short memories of what had happened. When asked what occurred after Griggs fell, Peter Moll, one of the posse, replied, "Well, I saw either 1, 2, or 3, or 4 men present pistols down and fire. Whether 1, 2, 3, or 4 fired after he fell, I don't know. At the same time he fired, someone fired out of the barn." When asked if he saw anybody shoot Griggs other than William Whitbeck, he again replied he saw 1, 2, 3, or 4 come up, and then I saw a number fired him, or at least presented him. They pointed at him anyway. So the next person, Charles Wands, he had a difficult time remembering the details of the day. Other than John and Benjamin, he couldn't remember who else he saw there until it was painfully dragged out of him by constant repetitive questioning. "Well, I don't know. John and Benjamin, there was a number of them there. I can't tell all. I don't know as I remember any of the rest. I saw them there anyway as we was talking. Crean was there and his 2 hired men were there." When asked how many he thought were there, he said, "Well, sir, I cannot say. I didn't count them. There was Charles Garrison and Alonzo Airing. I don't know as I can remember any of the rest of them. That's all I remember. There may have been a few more there, but not as I can think of. Well, there might have been some strangers. There may have been some at that I am acquainted with." Neither could he remember how long he had been in the barn or whether others had been there with him. He was equally confused about why he had run when he saw the posse coming. His contradictory and vague statements caused the coroner hurriedly to suggest, "You must have a short memory," to which he replied, "I am rather short." Anyway, they had a funeral for Griggs in Sand Lake, and then the inquest continued on Friday at the courthouse in Troy. And again, people's memories had not improved any at this point. Daniel Sharp, who lived in Wynenskill, had gone to the Whitbeck's farm on Saturday. He was called to testify. He was asked to go by William and Edward Behringer. The Behringers said they had an invitation to make hay, and since he had nothing nothing else to do, he went along. He stated that he did not take a gun, and neither did the Beringers. He acknowledged that he had not worked in the hayfield that day. There was considerable talk of those there about the dispossession. After a while, he'd gone back up as far as Lansing's. When questioned further about a gun, he stated he did have a gun with him while at Wynneskill, because he was going to shoot pigeons. They roosted under the shed at Casey's Tavern. He had put the gun in his wagon, the same wagon he had taken to William Whitbeck's that Saturday afternoon. He claimed they were tame pigeons, and since everybody and the bartender shot at them, he thought he would have a shot at them too. He stated that he had not shot at them, but he had shot at them, but he hadn't hit any. I couldn't shoot with that gun across this room and kill them. Hurley asked him what was the purpose of taking the gun along if it was not good for anything. He insisted he wanted to try to shoot at the birds. When asked if it was possible the gun might have been removed from the wagon while at the Whitbecks, he responded, well, it might have been by the women. The testimony wrapped up with a few more questions about the pigeons. What were you doing when you met the Beringers? Nothing. What were you intending to do? I was going to shoot pigeons. The gun was not worth the powder to blow it up. What enticement did Beringer make for you going to the Whitbecks? Nothing more than he said he was going, he wanted me to go along. Did you see the bartender? Yes, sir. Did you see the pigeons? No, sir. Well, when all this was going on, our dear old Colonel Church, he had another plan going on. He was getting fingers in all sorts of things. He was at this inquest on August 6, while his buds from the Erie faction, James Fisk and Jay Gould, were planning on scheming to get control of the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad. And they wanted him, as a small stockholder, to serve as their president because he was eligible as being a stockholder. And neither of them, as wealthy as they were, had ever invested anything in the Albany and Susquehanna Road. Now, this road had been going on since 1852, had been founded, and it was not completed from Albany to Binghamton until January of 1869. And that's when this James Fisk decided that they should control it so they could link it with their Erie and control things. So, anyway, this soon erupted into violence. The governor took military control of the railroad. And altogether, it is the most magnificent, entertaining, and distracting muddle of modern times. It is better than the anti-rent war. The confusion of the thing is so beautiful, it is so exquisitely incomprehensible. And all ordinary uproars are seen through. He managed to be sublime by keeping it just in the outer limits of popular comprehension. Well, anyway, on August 12th, the jury gave the verdict that the said Willard Griggs came to his death at his residence in the village of Sand Lake in the county of Rensselaer on the 2nd day of August from wounds and blows inflicted on his person on 26th day of July, 1869 on the premises of William Whitbeck. Now, notice it doesn't say it was murder or anything. It just says, and that was all the jury was supposed to do, was just do what it did. However, Coroner Hurley immediately decided it was murder. And so with that, he decided that William Whitbeck had to be in jail. He pronounced him well enough to be taken to jail, in spite of a judge's order of habeas corpus that said that William was to stay at his house through the weekend and there would be a hearing on it at his house later. But anyway, Hurley himself dragged William off to jail on Saturday afternoon. And at this point, Sarah Whitbeck, William's wife, went to jail with them. They had a little apartment set up there in the jail where she could stay with them. It'd been used by a few other famous people at that time too, so she was in there with them. Well, there was another hearing, and on Friday afternoon, August 20th, if the Whitbecks agreed that the charge would be murder, the judge allowed them out on bail, and they each posted bonds worth $10,000 apiece. Well, they were waiting for a grand jury. Meanwhile, the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad had an election on September 7th, and part of the scheme was to fill the room so completely that none of the legitimate stockholders could get in there. And so Church, with his connections in South End of Albany, found a bunch of these unemployed people again to fill the room. And he would later acknowledge that he was engaged in a business in the city of Albany where, in connection with the sheriff, we have been obliged to get a good many resolute men to execute the law as a posse comitatus, and we pay pretty well for the service, and consequently it has brought this whole gang of loafers in the city of Albany around me for employment. So he pretty much admitted that these were, not the greatest folks to be a posse. Well, anyway, in October, the grand jury came back with a charge of riot, and this really upset Church, because you'll notice he was actually charged as well. And his claim was, well, I wasn't even there, so how could I be charged? Obviously, he was not happy with this. The Whitbecks were pretty relieved. They thought it was going to be over. Unfortunately, there were 2 more grand juries held, and finally in January, Colonel Church got the indictment that he was looking for, which was first-degree murder. And this was for William Benjamin John Zadok Bass and William Woods, who had fled. Well, Will Woods was found at his father's farm in Earville, Illinois, and he was brought back to Troy on a charge of murder. Now charged with a crime punishable by death, the case was changed to the Supreme Court, where Judge Rufus W. Peckham presided, and the Whitbecks appeared before him on February 14th and pleaded not guilty. But out of the blue, Mr. Beach, for the prosecution, made a motion for a change of venue. This really took the defense attorney, Martin Townsend, by surprise, and he requested that they have until Monday the 21st to respond to the request. Meanwhile, the Whitbecks went home. Well, they came back on February 21st. And after last week's bewildering motion by the prosecution, friends of the accused and other interested parties came to listen. It was reported that there was a large sprinkling of prominent farmers from all parts of the county in attendance. Unlike last week's hearing, where the accused sat conspicuously with their lawyers before the judge, the Whitbecks and Bass entered the courtroom and seated themselves among their friends, blending in well and presenting themselves as curious spectators. Wood remained in jail. The unique nature of the hearing and the assemblage of legal talent was also of immense interest to other members of the bar, who turned out in force. Each side was represented by the best available legal talent, and an argument upon a motion of this nature being very rare, the members of the bar were present almost en masse. District Attorney Banker immediately opened the hearing, arguing for the change of venue. The motion for a change of venue is essential if there is to be a fair trial in this case. Nearly every farmer or real estate holder in Rensselaer County has at some time been interested in the anti-rent controversy, either directly or indirectly. The tragedy at the Whitbeck farm may be regarded as a result of this anti-rent controversy. It will be difficult to find an impartial jury from the jury pool in this county. A strong feeling in favor of the Whitbecks exists because their cause is regarded as a common cause. The failure of 2 grand juries to indict the Whitbecks for murder is illustrative of the general feelings of prejudice in favor of the accused. Well, after hearing arguments for a while, the judge said that he would make his decision by next Wednesday. But before the court adjourned, Mr. Beach rose again and requested, "Your Honor, I move that some disposition be made of the defendants until the court should pass upon this motion." And he said, "If a motion be made that they be taken into custody, I deem it my duty to so order them." And he was known for this spectral finger, and he pointed it at the defendants and ordered, "Sheriff, take them into custody." Now, they had come away that day being on bail, expecting to go home, and suddenly now they were arrested and taken to jail. Well, on March 2nd, after several more hearings, Judge Peckham ordered the trial to be moved to Saratoga County. Albany County had all been involved in the anti-rent war too, and they felt there was just too much pretrial publicity in Albany County either. So Saratoga County had not been involved in much of this, and they felt that would be a safe place to get a fair jury. Well, changing view in criminal cases. We regard this decision as important, novel one, as well as very flattering to the vanity of editors. Really, in Judge Peckham's view, newspapers are become a dangerous power for a friend as well as foe. It behooves a prisoner to procure an injunction restraining all the newspapers from speaking a word in his favor. It used to be thought desirable to have good character, but the time has now come, it seems, when the scripture is fulfilled, woe unto you when all men shall speak well of you. Well, they were held in jail except Zadok Bass. He was released in April to bury his 6-month-old daughter Sadie, and he would be out on bail through the trial. Judge Peckham himself was actually elected to the Court of Appeals, the highest court in the state of New York. The trial was postponed from May until July because the judge that had been assigned was too busy. This meant that there was not going to be another year of farming for the Whitbecks, and so William mortgaged another farm, and elderly Benjamin Dennison, who had been with him that day, his father-in-law, died on June 17th. Well, the trial finally did start, July 6th. Zadok Bass, however, was not there because when they gathered everybody at the train station in Troy, they forgot him. And so they all boarded the train. Obviously, nobody was keeping track of who the defendants were, and so he was left standing at the platform. So when they got up to Saratoga to start the trial and to start, looking for jurors, the defense said, well, wait a minute, we can't go ahead with this until he gets here. So he was on a freight train coming up. So things got delayed for a few hours until he managed to catch another train up to Saratoga. The prosecution was led by William Beach and Matthew Hale. And interesting, Matthew Hale, who was a prosecution for the state, was also Colonel Church's, with the firm of Colonel Church's private attorneys. So it seemed like a little bit of a conflict there. Anyway, the defense started its case on the 5th day. The defense team was a bunch of very notable attorneys from the Troy and Albany: Martin Townsend, Edgar Fursman, and R.A. Parmenter of Troy, and Henry Smith of Albany. And Henry Smith had gotten into a little tiff with Colonel Church back during the Civil War, so they really weren't particularly good friends. And of course, they had Lemuel B. Pike of Saratoga. If this case is to be tried before a Saratoga County jury, we have got to have Lem Pike. It is not a matter of choice, but of necessity. It is much as our client's neck is worth not to have him. Now, the issue was that William Beach, who was for the prosecution, had been DA in Saratoga County, and people really were liking him. So the defense decided that they too needed to have a local person if they were going to have any luck in this case. Several of William Whitbeck's daughters were present at this time. There is no mention of his wife whatsoever. The first thing the defense did was that they moved for a discharge of William Wood, the young man that had been brought back from Illinois, and this was granted after discussion. There was really actually no evidence that he'd really had any real role in this other than being there that day. And as to who gave Griggs his fatal wound, it don't appear in evidence with any certainty. McGraw thought there was a muss and gets an axe. As to who gave Griggs his fatal wound, McGraw thought there was a muss and gets an axe. He hits a man with it who he swears was doing him no injury, and then he hurls the axe at the crowd. Who did the axe hit? Mr. Hale says it's ridiculous to say that it hit Griggs. Why ridiculous? There was a wound found on Griggs' skull 1.5 inches long by 1 inch wide. Is it so ridiculous to suppose the axe McGraw threw made it? This McGraw is the man who when William Whitbeck was lying on the ground, shot him, goes up and strikes him on the head with a brick. McGraw was one of the posse drawn from Albany for the sake of saving the farmers of Rensselaer and any inconvenience. So none of the Whitbecks took the stand in their own defense. Amid the very stillness of death, at 8:20 a.m., 12 tired jurors filed into the courtroom and took their seats. The prisoners took their seats at the bar, trembling with expectation concerning the decision, all unknown to them as yet, which should consign them to the gallows, the prison, or their freedom. They kept their heads low, unable to look at the 12 men who had just decided their fate. The clerk said, "The jury will look upon the prisoners and the prisoners upon the jury." The prisoners' gaze met that of the jury. The clerk addressing the jury foreman, Warren Dake of Greenfield, "Do you find the prisoners guilty or not guilty?" And Warren Dake replied loudly and clearly, "Not guilty." Now, I don't if you know who the Dakes are, but the Dakes are the family that owns Stewart stores. So he's one of the, I don't know what quite the relationship is, but he was part of the family that now owns the Stewart stores. Well, Judge James ordered the prisoners to step forward to a bench. And Mr. Whitbeck, I recommend that you withdraw from any anti-rent organization with which you might be connected and buy out the manorial lease on your property on the best terms possible to prevent any further disturbances. But no such order to negotiate was given to Colonel Church, and he was damned if he was gonna. Well, the Troy Daily Times wrote the prisoners were now restored to liberty and the enjoyment of domestic peace, sweetened by their long enforced denial of both. But unfortunately, that was not the case for William. As of the fall of 1871, William was living in Illinois in Fayette County. He still continued appeals to get the farm back. The courts consistently stood with Colonel Church. The only thing Church was on the losing side of was the A&S Railroad. And in 1870, that line was rented to the D&H. So he did lose out on that one. Now, a lot of people think that there's, the people are spooked or cursed. This is just kind of interesting. I don't like to go on and say there was a curse on these folks, but I think it's kind of interesting that if you look at a lot of the people that were involved in this, many of them died relatively young, fairly shortly after. Now, Judge Romaine, he had been involved in some of the early aspects of it. He died 1871 at the age of 63. District Attorney Timothy Banker, he died in 1871, and he was only 44 years old. Thomas Hurley, who was the coroner, he died, again, 1871, and he was only 31 years old. Judge Hogaboom, another one of the judges that was involved, died in 1872. He was 64. The star witness at one point, Thomas Olcott, of the Olcott family in Tenbrook Mansion, he committed suicide in 1873. And Judge Peckham, he died in the sinking of the steamer Villa de Havre off the coast of France in November 22nd, 1873. So a lot of people that were associated with this seem to have very untimely deaths fairly close to the end of all of this. Now, in September 1874, Sarah Whitbeck divorced William for adultery. She was given custody of the two younger sons, Alberto and William Henry, both of whom would eventually move to the town of Guilderland. Finally, in 1876, the Court of Appeals made its final ruling on William's farm. The time for redemption being limited by statute and having expired, and the statute declaring all relief at law or in equity to be barred, the court had no discretion in the matter and was bound upon the facts to dismiss the complaint. So finally, after all of this, William still loses. But this was still not the end of the violence. You would think maybe enough was enough. But again, going back to those Finkel brothers, in 1874, Calvin Finkel, who was a brother of Peter Finkel, he was charged with malicious trespass by Church. Police officers went to Blooming Grove with a warrant for his arrest. They told Calvin they had a warrant for his arrest. He replied, "You blankety blank, you arrested me last July. You won't arrest me now. You blankety blank, you and Church have persecuted me long enough, but you won't persecute me any longer, and you can't arrest me now." Well, Calvin struck the officer on the head with a hickory cane, and the officer shot Finkel and killed him instantly. Colonel Church finally died in 1890. He was bankrupt, and his gravestone is probably the most boring headstone in Albany Rural Cemetery. He's buried in his niece's plot. Her stone is on the right, his is on the left, and you see all it says is Church and his birth and death years. However, in his will, he did bequest his sister $3,000 annually. The payments were to come from his farms in North and East Greenbush, formerly belonging to J. Knickerbocker DeFriest, Martinus Lansing, and William Whitbeck. Now, these were three farms and farmers that he had had long-standing arguments with, and so he hung on to those. I don't know, obviously at some point he must have sold them off after he died, but at some point, but those were the ones that he was hanging on to for practically life, obviously. But what became of William? That's a big million-dollar question. We've never been able to find out what became of him. You can see his wife's headstone there. She's in the Blooming Grove Cemetery. She says Sarah, and wife of William Whitbeck. Even after she divorced him, she still had on her tombstone that she was the wife of William. We have no idea what became of William. We can find no record of him. At one point, it seemed he was out in Michigan with his one son who died out there, but that's the mystery. Where is he? So, any questions? Yes.
In Sand Lake Cemetery, William Griggs is buried, and right next to him is Big Thunder.
Right, yep, right across from each other.
The reason why they did that?
I think maybe they probably just had family plots there. It is interesting. I mean, they actually were friends. I mean, it sounds near the end like they wouldn't be, but, you know, in the early days, they really were friends, so.
Did Griggs die first?
Oh yes, Griggs definitely died first. Griggs died in 1869, and Big Thunder didn't die, I don't think, till like 1890 or somewhere, 1880, something like, so he definitely outlived Griggs. Yes?
How did the rent wars resolve themselves finally?
Finally, it just, basically people either bought out their farms from Church, a lot of them. It just sort of like became a non-issue. People have told me, and I've never seen it, that there are still, as of recently in the last 20 years, there are still deeds out there that have the clause that they have to pay rent. But I think it was just, you know, when Church died, he was the one that was enforcing it, and he died, so they just sort of faded. Oh. Yes?
Where did the whole Calico Indian thing come from?
That was how they dressed up. They dressed up in calico. The clothes that the Indians wore, it was made, the wives generally, who were also sworn to secrecy, made them out of calico. And there's some references to some of these guys going and buying large quantities of calico in local shops. So the calico was just the material that they wore for their disguises.
Who came up with this idea?
I don't know, probably it was cheap, and I don't know. I think it was sort of came from the idea of the Boston Tea Party with the Indians dressing up to dump the tea in the harbor. So I think that was sort of, you know, blame it on the, you know, indigenous folks. So, you know. Yes?
Jill, I seem to have read somewhere that some of the farmers, groups of farmers, tried to team up with working class people from New York City to work together. Do you know anything about that?
Well, there was at some point, there actually was an anti-rent organization in New York City. I don't know that they had the same goals. There were some people that were trying to equate, if you guys here on the farms are complaining about being tenants, then what about the urban people being tenants? And the difference was that the people in the cities generally weren't bound for life. I mean, that was more, and but there is some. I've read a little bit about there being some connection with the urban folks. I don't know much about it though. Any other questions? Yes.
So just to respond to that, there was something in New York City called the National Reform Association, that would be an unfortunate acronym, NRA, that was that had proposed basically a nationwide reform in the way land ownership and was handled. And the idea there was that it would relieve some of the pressures of excess workers in the city so that they could become farmers.
Okay.
So that was the
Yeah, well, I know there was the free soil movement, which was just about the same time as the anti-rent movement in the late 1850s, where the opening the lands in the west of the United States should be open to individual landowners and not be allowed to be controlled by these gigantic, wealthy people who rented it out. So that was part of it, to try to, the free soil was to get individual landowners out onto the land at the same time. Yes.
So I just want to understand how this concluded. The people who inherited the land basically stopped collecting rent, and the people who were leasing the land, how did they get a title to it?
Well, a lot of them did actually buy out, like when the judge told William to buy out your leases. A lot of them actually did. I mean, Church did at some point come up with there was a formula that at 6% interest, and so on. So a lot of them did actually buy it and get clear title. Like I say, people have told me that there are still titles out there that still have that on it. I don't know. So I think some of it just sort of like, when Church died, he was the last one that was trying to collect. So when he died, obviously that kind of ended his dynasty. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of loose ends in this. I mean,
Thank you.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah, the original owner of my house was a lawyer hired by Church to normalize some of the rents up in the Hellerbergs. And I think he was doing that until 1940.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I say I've heard that there were deeds that had those conditions in them way into the 20th century. So now, if you're interested in more details, I did write a book. I have books for sale up here. If you don't want to buy one, but you want to read it, the library has a copy, as do many of the other local libraries. So it's called The Time for Redemption. If you want to know more about the Finkel brothers and Big Thunder himself, I'm giving a talk through Hudson Valley's Center for Creative Retirement on Monday, November 6th. That's specific to the Finkel brothers and Big Thunder and their exploits. And as I say, the Finkels were really bad dudes. There were, I think, 7 brothers, and they were really mean folks. The title of that talk is Crusader or Criminal. And I'm trying to make the argument that some of these folks really weren't crusading so much for a real cause, but just basically were thugs that were, out to make trouble. So, but that's there's still seats available. That's, again, November 6th at Hudson Valley Community College, their Center for Creative Retirement. You can sign up for that. So, any other questions? Well, thank you.